for joining us for this afternoon's webinar. Netacea's CTO, Andy Still, and Head of Threat Research, Scott Pendlebury, are joined by Forrester Principal Analyst, 𝗤𝗁dy Carielli, to discuss emerging trends in the bot landscape. 𝗤𝗁dy advises security and risk professionals on application security. Her research covers topics such as proactive security design, security testing in the software delivery lifecycle, protection of applications in production environments, and remediation of hardware flaws. To start us off, Andy is going to give us a short introduction to bots.
Thanks, Danny, and welcome everyone today. I'll very quickly set the scene on some of the things we're going to talk about in the rest of the webinar. Give a quick overview of bots themselves, what they're up to, and how we see it moving in the industry today. So what do we mean by a bot? Basically, a bot is any request that's made by an automated process, not that's been directly triggered by humans. Now, obviously, there's a wide range of those. We've got quite a lot of good bots that the internet largely depends on, search engines being the most obvious one of those, but equally there's a lot of bad bot activity out there, and we'll cover off a lot more of that as we go through today's presentation. One thing I did want to just highlight at this point is that when we're talking about bad bots, they are very different from what we talk about when we talk about hacking activity, though the actual people behind them may be the same group of people that are attempting to do something fundamentally different. Hackers are there to look for technical weaknesses, and they carry out illegitimate actions to try and bypass those. For example, things like SQL injection attacks to access databases. Bots, though, are actually automated processes that are carrying out what is legitimate activity on your website. So exactly the same activity as your real visitors would be doing, but they're looking to exploit what we call business logic weaknesses within your website. In fact, we would say that at the moment, because of the advances in traditional security, we're seeing that
Andy, sorry, Andy.
Yeah.
I've just had a message. It hasn't started properly yet.
Oh, right, okay.
Bearing with. Hang on. I'm just going to change presenter to me. Hang on. Late in starting there were a few technical hitches. I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar. We will be joined by Andy Pendlebury, who is our Head of Threat Research, and Scott and Andy will be in discussion today with 𝗤𝗁dy Carielli, Principal Analyst at Forrester. 𝗤𝗁dy advises organisations the emerging trends in bot traffic. I'd like to start today with Andy, who will be giving us a bit of an introduction to bots.
Thanks, Danny. I just want to check that everyone can see my screen before we start. Okay.
Should now be good to go. Again, apologies for everybody.
Okay. Thank you, Danny, and thanks for overcoming the technical issues that I know you've been having fun with. Get going. Before we go into a lot more depth of what we're going to cover off in today's webinar, I just wanted to give everyone a very quick introduction into what we mean by bots and just set the scene a little bit for some of the stuff we'll go into in more depth. So what do we mean when we start talking about bots? Very simple level, when we talk about bots, we mean anything that's triggered by an automated process rather than something that's triggered directly by a human action. Obviously, there's quite a wide range of different bots that are out there. from good bots like search engines, which obviously the internet largely depends on, to very bad bots, which we'll cover off in a bit more detail overall. But there's also bots that operate in the gap in between good and bad. And I think I wanted to just call out before we go much further that when we talk about bots, they are very different from what we think of traditionally as hacking-based activity. Hackers were traditionally trying to exploit weaknesses, technical weaknesses in your actual application or in your platform, and carry out illegitimate activities in order to exploit those, such as a SQL injection attack as a way of breaking into a database. Whereas when we talk about bot activity, they are what the bot operator is doing is actually carrying out legitimate activity, just the same activity as a legitimate visitor would do, but they're trying to exploit weaknesses in the business logic of your website to try and bypass defenses that way. And we've seen this grow as traditional types of defenses have got much, much better. Hackers have moved on to looking, can they use bot activity instead? We would therefore say that for a lot of websites that are out there and a lot of mobile apps, business logic is the new weak point for those applications which the bot operators are trying to exploit. So I thought it'd be worth just talking you through a very quick real-world example of some of action that we've seen from bots and some of the end results that can have. So to start from the end, this is an example of a couple of companies who were hit by a bot attack, and the end result here was they had some very unhappy customers and it made it into the press, which is never a good situation for any company. But what had actually happened with this? Essentially, there had been someone had been illegally accessing valid customer accounts. They'd been looking for past orders that could be refunded using an automated process. Those refunds were given in credit that could be used for further orders within that account, and that credit was then being used to place that order. But what's interesting about this from our point of view is it illustrates that actually what's a fairly straightforward process was actually a large amount of different types of bot activity that had come together in order to carry out that fraudulent activity. And the way this probably looked was that there was, at some point, there was an external data breach of a load of credentials. Those credentials are then used, they were probably purchased over the dark web somewhere, and then used on to actually carry out credential stuffing attack against the specific sites that we're talking about here. When that person carrying out that attack had validated a certain amount of credentials that he knew were active on this particular site, they were then sold off as for extra value as validated credentials. They were then used with a much more complex script, bot script, to actually look which of those valid user sets of credentials could be used to actually carry out the next stage of this fraud, which was identify ones with the right type of order that could then be automatically refunded. At that point, you then had an account that was valid and you knew had a certain amount of credit on it, and that then obviously has a material value that you can sell on to the end step in this, which is someone actually then executes the fraud. And I think the most important part of this for me is that it was obviously a lot of different actors there who've come together to carry out this fraud. But the most important part is that at no point has there been any invalid functionality of that website executed. It's just been executed by different people and they've been undertaking a different workflow than was anticipated. It was all perfectly valid. It was valid user accounts there, and that is a valid use of business logic. It's valid business logic to give people refunds, and it's valid that those refunds be available in credit to use on future orders. It's just fraudsters are now looking at ways of getting around ways that people are delivering good customer service. And I think what else to take from that is that what we call the bot ecosystem is a fairly elaborate set of tools, services, as well as data and people here. So we'll see a wide variety of tools, and we'll illustrate some of these as we go through this presentation. But it's important to remember this is a very big business. It's multi-billions of dollars going through these tools every year right around the world to target vast amounts of websites and lots of different techniques being used to actually exploit business logic weaknesses. So at that point, I'd like to hand over to Sandy to just go in a bit more detail about what she sees as the bot landscape and some of the emerging threats at the moment.
All right, thank you very much, Andy, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Andy, as you said, bots are big business, and bots are pervasive. Forrester's looked at this, and fact is, bad bots comprise about 20% of all web traffic. And then if you put good bots on top of that, you're hitting around 35% or so of web traffic. But bad bots are pervasive. You're probably seeing them a lot in your environment. Maybe you realize it, maybe you don't. And as Andy said, they're attempting a variety of different types of attacks on your business. And we'll walk through some of these. What's really interesting about bots is just the range of attacks and the range of people that they are going after. You have attacks such as web scraping, credential stuffing, and web recon that are often of concern to security professionals. But then you also have your e-commerce and your fraud team that's going to be concerned about checkout abuse, about inventory hoarding, about card fraud. And you also have your marketing team that's going to be worried about ad fraud. And then at the end, you also have concerns about influence fraud and other issues along those lines. So you have a range of bots, a range of different types of attacks, and therefore a range of personas and stakeholders that have to be engaged in solving this problem. Very often when we talk about application security issues and web application protection issues, we're mostly talking to the security team. In this case, we need to extend broader. Bad bots and bot attacks are a concern of security. They're a concern of the marketing team. They're a concern of the fraud team, the e-commerce team, and the customer experience team. Because the end customer, the end user who has their credentials stolen or who can't buy the product that they want or finds themselves challenged to use the website because of bots, they're going to have a really difficult experience and be unhappy. So those are all of the different attitudes and stakeholders that we need to be addressing. Now, Andy, as we've said, it's not just about the wider range of personas, but you're also seeing a wider range of attack approaches, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think we've carried out a bit of research recently where we asked a select group of website owners what sort of attacks they were seeing. And I think what was interesting from this is that whilst a lot were seeing attacks on their website, there was actually more who were seeing attacks on their mobile app, and even a fair amount seeing attacks on their API. And this reflects, I think it undersells what we're actually seeing when we're examining this in the real world. We're seeing as websites are getting better defended, the attackers are moving on to look for other easier targets. I think APIs particularly, we're starting to see in some situations more attacks being made against APIs. And I think this probably reflects that as people are seeing business logic is the new weak point, we're actually seeing that APIs are actually the new weak point for business logic attacks.
So let's talk about a couple of examples of the types of attacks we're seeing. Web scraping is one that, let's dive into that because that can be damaging from an anti-competitive standpoint, but also from the standpoint of your customer's privacy. Several months ago, there was a case where a company was scraping data off of LinkedIn profiles and using that to offer a service to tell employers whether their employees might be updating their profiles and therefore possibly looking for new jobs. And there were some lawsuits and legal cases about it. But as you can see, the court has said that scraping public data might actually be allowable from a legal standpoint. So if you're going to protect your customers, if you want to make sure that their data, that they feel safe with the data that they are posting to your social media site or to other sites, bot management and protecting from bot attacks is going to be really critical because you want to make sure your customers feel good working with you. Let's also talk about credential stuffing. Credential stuffing is when attackers buy large amounts of stolen credentials from credential dumps that have already happened, breaches that have already occurred, and they buy those credentials, usernames and passwords off of the dark web, and then they realize, well, many people reuse those credentials. So let's try what we stole from one site onto another site and see how many users are reusing their account information. How many new accounts can we break into on this new site? So with credential stuffing, you may be securing credentials perfectly well, but if your customers has reused them and attackers have managed to take them, they're able to then log into your site as your customer, and that customer is going to get pretty upset and have a very bad experience. You're going to be cleaning up fraud, so it's bad for you, it's bad for your customers. Now, Scott, I think there are some attack methods around credential stuffing that are worth diving into a little bit here.
Yeah, that's right, Stanley. Thanks so much for that. Hi, everyone. So, yeah, as Stanley said, there's a lot that goes into credential stuffing, and I think, the concept of it isn't something that's new, but the techniques and the ecosystem around it is evolving and it is changing. So, over the next few slides, that's really something that I just kind of want to go into. So, going back to the research that Andy mentioned earlier that we did, one of the interesting findings in there was we asked, are you aware of any marketplaces that exist where customer credentials are being sold? And this ties into the whole ecosystem around credential stuffing. And really, to our surprise, the response was that there was no one that we asked who was actually aware that these marketplaces do exist and where these customer credentials are. And that was interesting to us because this is something that we're sort of involved in daily. And it's always the case, or in the majority of cases, we often find that we can find things at 𝗏𝗏 relating to really most businesses that we're kind of looking into. So that was quite an interesting finding. So what we're going to do is, just like I said, have a little look at how certain things around the ecosystem and around credential stuffing are changing. So we start off, just got a quick little video just to show how easy it is to kind of come across credentials online. So literally none of this, what we're going to show, is done on the dark web. It's all clear web. You search for, say, for example, check my dump. It takes you to a Twitter feed, and the Twitter feed pulls in pastes that are made on Pastebin that match what looks like a combo list, so a combination of email addresses and passwords. So this is openly available stuff. There's that many data breaches that happen nowadays that there's a proliferation of data, and so it's easy to kind of find that data and use that in a credential stuffing attack. So once you've got your, let me just move the slide on, sorry. Once you've got your list of credentials, what you then need is a way to distribute the attack using those creds. So it used to be, many attackers would use things like open proxy lists such as these. You can find proxy lists to distribute an attack through. But if you're going to use free lists like this, you'll find that the IPs that you use they've got poor reputation, they're very easy to block, they come from data centers, they come from compromised devices that get cleaned up, and the proxy doesn't stay up very long. So what we see a lot more of use of now by attackers is distributing attacks through residential proxies. So that's the use of home, maybe mobile devices to proxy traffic through. So you're not going through a data center, you're actually pumping traffic through home internet connections. And I think what's interesting about these businesses is they are legitimate, they are professional, none of this is illegal, and it kind of harkens back again to what Sandy was saying, that there's a grey area maybe that this ecosystem kind of operates in. So one of the services, or one of the kind of offerings that 𝗏𝘁𝘁𝗁𝗁, for example, lists is that if you use our service, you won't see capture when you funnel your traffic through us. And again, it's one of those things where, just the same as scraping, it's not illegal to bypass capture, but it's not really something that you're hoping to find out is happening on your site. But I think what's also interesting about these proxy services is the way they work. So on the left there, I've got 𝗏𝘁𝘁𝗁𝗁, and the way their business model works is, instead of having app developers show adverts in, say, a mobile game that they've got on the Play Store, what they do instead is they say, integrate our code into your game, and when the game's not being played and the phone is idle, we can proxy traffic through that phone and into wherever our customers want to go. On the other side, you've got 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, so the same thing, they're a residential proxy service, but they approach the problem in a slightly different way. So they offer a free VPN to be used. Apparently the VPN is terrible, but lots of people use it. And again, if that VPN is present on the phone when the phone's idle, it's freed for 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 customers to pump traffic through. So you've got your distribution, and now it's going to have a quick look at some of the tooling that's actually used in some of the credential stuffs that we see. So one of the main tools, one of many that we see used, is 𝗏𝗶𝗳𝗁𝗏. And there's a couple of reasons why it's quite popular for attackers to use. First reason is because it's easy to use. It's got a nice accessible interface. It's not too difficult to actually build a credential stuff using this tool. As you can see there, you can sort of stack what it is that you want to do in a nice sort of drag and drop way of doing that and managing it. On the other side, you've got sophisticated attackers who recognize, well, there's a lot of powerful inherent capability in this tool to build quite a complex attack. So they'll be able to configure the tool to not only credential stuff the site, but then navigate around. Once they're in an account, they'll have a look to see how many loads points a customer has. If they've got above a certain threshold, take one action. If they've got beneath it, do another, and so on. So another tool, it does a similar thing. It credential stuffs sites, but it's a little bit easier to use than 𝗏𝗶𝗁𝗏. So again, it's doing that thing where we keep seeing time and time again. You've got a supposed legitimate use for this tool. So it says it's for account recovery. That's not the intended use of the tool, and that's not how it was actually developed with that in mind. It's clear to see. But the way this works is if you've not got the web application knowledge, say to build a configuration to take down a particular site or to configure a site, they have profiles that you can use to say target, I don't know, Gmail or anything like that you want to actually credential stuff. So just moving on from there just a little bit, let's say, for example, the attacker's not got the ability to configure 𝗏𝗶𝗁𝗏 to take down a site or credential stuff a site. They've gone onto 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 and they've not got the profile there they want to use. Part of this ecosystem that we're talking about involves the lots of signs of different services, and one of those services is people that will create you a config for a site that you want to credential stuff. So let's say, for example, we want to credential stuff Radisson Hotel. That will cost you $15 to do so. What's interesting about these services that are being set up and as part of the ecosystem itself is that in becoming more professional and more open, they're imitating, professional and legitimate businesses. So one way they'll imitate a professional business is through the use of warranties. So a warranty in this context would be, if you buy the Radisson Hotel credential stuffing config from me, I will guarantee for 4 days that if any changes are made to Radisson Hotel's login script or login process, I'll update the config to reflect those changes. So you've got a 4-day window to kind of attack the site with. And then just a final little point from me on this set is a little bit again about the ecosystem. So if we look here, you have for sale a Netflix account. So it's a year's access to a Netflix account. So we can say that the product of a credential stuff is, in this instance, access to Netflix. And I think what's interesting to us is really a couple of things and a couple of elements really to do with this. So the first one is around sentiment. So if you think back a few years ago when there was quite a lot around the Pirate Bay and torrenting films and so on, and you get a DVD and it said, oh, you wouldn't steal a handbag, you wouldn't steal a car and so on. There's a bit of a similar mindset here where it's not necessarily seen as stealing or anything malicious because you're buying access to something that's kind of unused. You're not actually taking something from someone, you're making use of an unused profile, say on the Netflix account, which is all well and good, but for a business that represents potential loss of earnings. The other side is that all of this ecosystem that supports this activity and related activity is becoming open, it's becoming mainstream, and that's driven really by competition between people wanting to make money from what they can do, selling accounts and so on. So just one final point for me is that it's interesting that everything that we're showing to do with this we've not had to go on the dark web to find it because it's all open and it is accessible, it is becoming mainstream. So now I was going to hand back to Sandy, who's going to have a look at checkout abuse.
Yeah, thank you very much, Scott. Checkout abuse, if I had been talking to you about this 6 months ago, I would have described a story like the following. You're a retailer or you're selling tickets to a concert. Maybe you're about to offer an exclusive new limited edition sneaker. So you open up for business and your site is inundated by bots who take up most of the inventory, buy up most of the sneakers, buy up most of the concert tickets, whatever, leaving very little else for your human customers, for your loyal customers, for the ones who are really excited to work with you. And so they leave really disappointed. And then they find those exclusive sneakers or concert tickets available on some resale site, marked up 2 times or whatever. And they're disappointed and they're frustrated. And so they're paying more for the merchandise they want. They don't feel very good about you as the vendor, and they're unhappy. And in the meantime, the attackers who launched those bots are making a tidy profit, acquiring the merchandise and reselling it at a huge markup. That's the story I would have told a few months ago. In quarantine times now, what is desirable merchandise has changed. People are no longer sending bots after, say, concert tickets. Now they're going after more basic necessities: toilet paper, hand sanitizer, grocery delivery times. A couple of months ago, maybe back in April or May, there was an article about how some enterprising developers are starting to create bots to take grocery delivery times. And you can imagine that that is leaving people out of the process who maybe need those delivery times. And there's the potential to make a profit and weaponize that as well. So bots are going to hoard whatever is considered desirable merchandise, whether it's sneakers, whether it's concert tickets, or whether it's toilet paper. And that is the environment in which we're living, which also means that as a retailer or a seller, you need to continue to be aware of whether your merchandise suddenly becomes popular and whether you may have a bot problem that perhaps you didn't have a few months before. Andy, I know you have some thoughts on some of the tool sets that are involved in that.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I'll just go through a few things. So I am struggling to get anything as good as a robot with sausages for arms. So I just wanted to pull out a few of the tool sets that are used in this area. And again, I wanted to get across the point of that Scott was raising as well, of just the level of professionalism and sophistication behind these tools. These are not hard to use tools. The bar is very low in terms of technical knowledge for people who want to use these. This is just a couple of examples of sneakerbot tools, and as you can see here, this shows you how well you've done over time. It shows you your successful transactions. It shows you how much you've spent against different sites and things like that. It basically enables you to run a full sneakerbot business. And we get the same when we look in ticketing as well. See here's examples of bots targeting particular ticketing sites, but what these bots will do is that they will hold tickets for those sites while they advertise them on third-party resale sites, and they'll have other bits of software that will track your entire inventory and even do the conversion of tickets from the format of one site into the name and address of the people who you've resold the tickets to. So these are full businesses. People can be up and running fairly easily with them, and as we see, there is good money to be made in them. So pass back over to Sandy now.
Yeah, let's hit on a couple of other types of bots and then talk about what it is you can do about them. So one of the realities is that applications are still the most common form of attack out there, and attackers often take advantage of software vulnerabilities and web application flaws in order to accomplish their attack. Web recon bots help aid that process by flooding the website with various potential application attacks, recording which ones are successful so that the attacker can then go back and dig deeper and really dive into what might be a successful, deeper attack on the site. Using the web recon bots to get the basic information about potential vulnerabilities. Is it vulnerable to certain open source vulnerabilities that are out there? Is it vulnerable to cross-site scripting or SQL injection? Is it running an unpatched version of a particular library? All of those are things that a web recon bot might do in order to facilitate the application attack. And then finally, we'll just hit on this briefly, there is the challenge of influence fraud, and we're seeing that socially and politically really all over the world, particularly in social media and on various sites where bots are spreading disinformation or making it appear that different groups of people are behaving or providing opinions in certain ways, and really attempting to sow dissension, create confusion, and spread disinformation. So that's just a taste of the types of bots that we're dealing with here. But now the question is, okay, what are people doing about it? Well, the good news is that we are seeing fairly wide adoption of bot management. There's certainly more work to be done, but as of 2019, Forrester went out to various security professionals and we did our survey and asked them, are you implementing bot management today? Are you planning to implement it in the next 12 months? What are your plans? And 49% of the security pros that we surveyed said they were implementing bot management, in the process of expanding their bot management solutions, or even upgrading. Another 20% are planning to do bot management implementation in the next 12 months. Now, what's unfortunate is that this isn't spread out equally across all industries. You can see that utilities and telco are leading in terms of how much they have implemented bot management. And media and entertainment has a strong plan to implement bot management solutions in the next 12 months at 32%. Government, on the other hand, is lagging, and they really need to catch up. Only 40% have implemented bot management already, and only 15% are planning to in the next 12 months. And the problem is that there are a lot of government sites out there, particularly during the pandemic, that are serving citizens, serving the government's customers, providing services that could be potentially vulnerable to bots, whether it's around small business loans or healthcare service or health information. All of those need to be accessible and safe and not vulnerable to fraud. So that's where government needs to be investing in order to catch up. That's one area of concern. So if you're looking for what you need in a bot management solution, here are a couple of key points. One, you want to make sure that your customer's experience is really frictionless and strong. You don't want customers to leave your site disappointed they didn't get the merchandise. You don't want your customers to be victimized by fraud bots or credential stuffing, but you also want them to have a really smooth user experience. So they're not constantly challenged, constantly having to solve CAPTCHAs that are difficult and confusing. You don't want them to get frustrated and go to another site. At the same time, you need to have really advanced attack detection. Bots come in different levels of sophistication. There are certainly basic low-end bots that are fairly easy to track, but then there are also going to be more and more sophisticated bots, including those that try to evade CAPTCHA. So you need to make sure that the attack detection on your bot management solution can track all different types of bots and realize that bots are evolving as all other types of attacks are. So you need to be able to prepare for and manage that. Next, think about the types of attack responses that you want. It's not just about blocking anymore. And it's not just about throwing CAPTCHAs out. You want to be able to distract the attacker, disrupt the attacker, make the cost of the attack so high to the attacker that it's no longer economically viable for them to attack your site and they go elsewhere. And that's going to be a combination of honeypots. It's going to be presenting fake data, sending people to fake websites, leaving connections open so that the attack just goes into basically an empty black hole, providing all sorts of different ways to frustrate and distract the attacker. And then finally, going back to what I said at the start about the range of stakeholders that are impacted by bot attacks, you need to make sure that your attack analytics and your reporting isn't just for security, that you're able to share that information usefully with your marketing team, with your e-commerce team, with your executive team, with your fraud team. And that means that you want a report that you can hand to your marketing team and say, here are some cases of ad fraud attacks that we saw last month. Here was an attempted hoarding attack. You hand that maybe to your e-commerce team. Here were some instances of card fraud. Pass those on to your card team so that you're really able to drill down into the intent of the attack as well as the fact that the attack occurred. So all that put together then, that means you have to be sharing the data. It's not just for security, but you need to be sharing the data broadly between all the different stakeholders, sharing information about what's going on, but also sharing as you are launching new services, launching new sales. If you're about to launch maybe a short 12 or 24-hour flash sale and you're on the e-commerce team, bring in the security team proactively to make sure that they're able to block bots. Engage with the fraud team and the executive team and the marketing team, and all of those groups and stakeholders need to be communicating on an ongoing basis to address that problem and ultimately keep the customers happy, because at the end of the day, it really is all about your end customers. And if I had to give one message to take home, that's what it's about. Bot management is about blocking bad bots, but it's also about ensuring a really smooth journey for your customers and making sure that they are happy and are able to transact business safely and effectively. Scott, I'll pass it back to you, and we can talk about some of the challenges of stopping bots. Or is that Andy?
It's me. And thanks, Andy. I think you've covered off quite a lot of the a lot of the dangers associated with bots. So I thought we'd actually just look at how we can actually go about stopping them. Now, this is not necessarily an easy problem to solve. And the main reason being, as we mentioned right at the start, these requests that are coming in from bots, they are exactly the same as the requests that come in from legitimate users. There's nothing you can do within that request itself to identify them. So we have to come up with a way of looking at all the requests and determining which is actually coming from bots. I think one of the issues that we see, and I think reflecting some of our research, is a large amount of customers think they have some kind of bot protection. They have full or partial bot protection, but not all bot protection is the same. It's a fastly evolving area, and we're seeing tools that are moving very quickly in order to address the fast pace of change for the actual bots themselves. And just quickly run you through the three main types there. Three main types of bot defense there are, and some of the challenges around that. So the first generation of bot defense very much focused on looking at network level traffic. That was typically add-ons to tools such as load balancers or WAFs or CDNs, and they would have fairly basic kinds of defense. So things like block lists of known bad IP addresses, or fairly common things were things like rate limiting to only allow a certain amount of connections coming through from certain places. The issues with these is that actually the majority of bots can now bypass those. So it doesn't take much of sophistication in bots. And just pull out an example of the sort of thing that we still commonly see when we're looking at scraping activity. We see bots or the scrapers will just try progressively higher and higher levels of activity, and they're doing that just to see if there's rate limiting in place. And as soon as they discover rate limit in place, they know the level at which they need to operate. So not too high a level of sophistication to bypass those. And what that led to was the second generation, and this is still the most common type of defense that we see against bots. This is what we call client-side defense. So the thinking went, well, bots are different from humans because they fundamentally do something different in how they actually make that request. Humans will use a browser on a laptop or a desktop, or they'll use a mobile app on an actual mobile device, and they'll interact with it in a very human way. A bot will be different. So essentially the way these work is that a client using a web browser or a mobile app will make a request to a server for requesting some content. That server will respond with the content, but also will pass back a set of activities that they want the browser or the app to undertake just to validate that they are a legitimate human user. And that typically is executed using JavaScript or executed within the mobile app. When that is executed, the output of that is a set of data that is sent back to the bot detection tool, which validates whether or not that is the data that it expected to see back, and therefore will feed back some advice on whether that user should be treated as a human or as a bot. Typical kind of things that we see here, we've got proof of work. So that assumes that bots probably can't execute these things in the same way as an actual user using their browser. So, for example, they don't have JavaScript available. The next type of detection we see is device fingerprinting. So that uses functionality available within the browser or the app to try and identify the exact device that this request has been executed from. and determine, one, whether that is the sort of device that a human would typically use, and also to see whether or not that device has been used multiple times, pretending to be multiple different visitors, sending it all from the same end device. And then the last form is user interaction tracking, for example, just looking at how is the mouse moved? Is that mouse being moved like a human would use it, or does it look more automated? Same with keyboard presses, and if it's on a mobile device, is that mobile device being held in a manner that a human would, or is it unnaturally still? Is it not moving and things like that? So the issue that we see with these kind of defenses is that you do put all your defenses in the hands of the attacker. So what do I mean by that? If we think about how this works, you've got a client making a request, and then the activities are sent back to the client to execute. The problem here is if it's a bot making a request, makes that same request, you send the same response back to the bot, then you rely on the bot to send the data back to the bot detection tool to validate its answer. So if the bot can fake those answers, it knows what you're asking for, and it knows what you're expecting to get back. And we see increasing levels of sophistication in bots to just bypass these problems. And the issue that has led to is that it essentially leads to an arms race between the bot and the bot defense tool. So the bot defense tool will put out a new client-side trap that the bot can't bypass, and that will be effective for a while, and then the bot will figure out a way to bypass that, and the defense tool needs to keep putting out continually ever more and more sophisticated types of detection. This has then led to, therefore, an extension to the bot ecosystem, which is systems that are designed for bypassing bot defenses. And again, we see these. I've pulled a couple out here. Very simple examples. These are from GitHub, which are scripts here that are designed to bypass certain parts of bot detection. These are readily available, and there's many more of them out there. I thought what was interesting about this one here, if we look on the bottom left, the person who's written this has actually made a note that because this tool continually changed and hardened the protection page, they've actually had to embed Node.js so that it can respond to JavaScript challenges. So essentially, they've now built the script that will automatically try and detect the new defenses that are in place and try and bypass those. So again, the arms race to ever try and outrace the client-side detection. So that's one issue with it. But I think the real issue that we see with this client-side kind of detection is, as that arms race has progressed, the defenses have had to get closer and closer to the edge of what is acceptable from a security and a privacy point of view, just to try and outpace what the bypasses can get past. And at some point, there is a risk that the risk associated with doing this from either a security or a privacy point of view will actually outweigh the benefit of the defense that they're putting in place. And we're seeing the browser manufacturers and the app platform starting to respond to this by just clamping down on some of the things that can be done, particularly around tracking PII data. And we do see that as cookie tracking is getting stricter, device fingerprinting is another way that people are using to personally identify devices and track users. So we're seeing browsers starting to clamp down on that, and also users, end users and customers being more uncomfortable with it. And I think just pass over quickly to Scott to just show some of the research that he's been doing in another area that we're seeing bot operators trying to bypass this.
Thanks, Andy. So if we just have a look for a moment and look at what encompasses or what makes up a browser fingerprint. So, a fingerprint of a browser is made up of, it looks to see if the HTML canvas can draw graphics, if the WebGL API can do the same, what fonts are installed in the client's browser, what plugins are there, and so on. And what these client-side controls are doing is they're looking for, if it's a genuine browser, like Andy said, they're looking for uniqueness of that browser and so on. And so because there's such a focus at the minute on the client side, it's the eternal game of cat and mouse with the attackers. So a lot of their focus has been on, well, how can we bypass these fingerprint controls and these client-side controls that are put in place on certain solutions. So they've gone about trying to solve the problem, and successfully solving the problem really in a couple of ways. So the first example of how it's been solved is through the Genesis market. So they thought, well, the best way to masquerade as a legitimate browser and legitimate user is to steal those fingerprints from actual legitimate users in browsers. So they've got they've got a botnet that, when it's installed, when the malware is installed on a user's machine, it infects the device. It takes the device's fingerprint from the browser, steals cookies, steals saved logins, form autofills, and all that kind of stuff, and it puts it for sale on this Genesis marketplace. You can see in the top left. So you purchase one of those fingerprints, and then you install it into a browser, and then you're browsing as that person, bypassing all the controls that would otherwise be put in place. The second way they've looked to approach and solve the same problem is, instead of stealing genuine fingerprints, what we can do instead is gain an understanding of what these client-side controls are looking for, like the bypasses that Andy's mentioned, and we can then create code that generates fingerprints that are genuine looking. You know, there's no conflicting information in them, and they're sort of tested against anti-fraud systems. So it's a couple of similar ways to solve the same problem that we're seeing quite a lot of use of. But one thing we kind of wanted to note, and as well, it's just going back to what we said earlier, is that these things might become redundant soon anyway. So Apple, who, you know, they're often at the forefront with privacy anyway, in their Safari privacy overview that was published late last year, they said they intend to combat fingerprinting to prevent it from happening altogether. So, you know, in both cases, those solutions might not even matter going forward. So just the final point on that is that if you're familiar with the concept of the pyramid of pain, when you're looking to cause the most pain for an attacker to sort of change up what they're doing, we've always focused on sort of the top of that pyramid, which is behavior and intent, because that's the hardest thing to change, and it's also something that can't be removed like these fingerprints can be.
Thanks, Scott. That's really interesting bit of research you're doing there, and I think it ties in very well with definitely the weakness we're seeing in some of the client-side defences in place. And I think one last point I would point out when we're looking for how you should defend from bot attacks is what we were saying earlier about APIs being the new weak point. And one of the reasons why that is so common now is because of the increased level of client-side detection in here, and obviously there is no client for an API. So when we're looking at defense, we need to make sure there is something that will defend APIs as well. So what moving on from that, the third generation, I think this is the way that we've seen the cutting edge of the bot defense market going, is not looking at the client, but actually looking at what's going on the server, but at a lower level. So what are the visitors actually doing? What is the functionality that they're undertaking on the server, therefore on your application? And can we determine whether or not that is legitimate activity or whether it is illegitimate activity? As we said before, what bots do is take legitimate activity, but they put it together into a different workflow, in the workflow that is trying to get to a different result than your customers are. And the way these kind of systems work is that basically look at what each visitor is doing. Does that match a known attack pattern? And then can we categorize that as a type of bot? Because as Sandy was saying, there's lots of different types of bots. They all present different types of threats. As well as looking at individual visitors, you can then also start looking at what all the visitors are doing across the entire platform. Because we find bots very rarely act on their own, particularly as defenses have increased. Bot operators will distribute bot attacks across many, many different visitors and look to hide that in amongst legitimate activity. But if you can start to categorize all visitor behavior into normal and unusual behavior, you can start then pulling out bot activity as bad, and you can also start keeping ahead of ever evolving attack methods that are coming out. As soon as you start seeing new types of activity that you've not seen before, you can investigate that and determine whether that is bad actors or whether that's actually just different types of users responding to some external event, change in functionality or marketing events, something like that. But if you can get this view of all the activity on your website, you can then easily start categorizing them into different types of bots, and then take appropriate action against them. So the issue with this problem, and I can reflect on this because we've been working on building this kind of system for several years now, is that you have to deal with very, very large amounts of data, and it takes very complex set of analysis in order to determine which visitors are undertaking which intent, particularly if you want to do that in real time. It's a complex problem to solve. But the results show that if you can get over those, then you see here a few examples of the kind of improved detection that you can get from that level compared to some of the other approaches that we've seen. And regularly we will see this one compared to approaches either built in-house or using other devices. It is a better way of spotting bot activity. So just to round up, I think a few points to pull out today. The first, I think we've shown that bot activity is incredibly sophisticated. There's a massive ecosystem of activity going on out there, and it's the tooling and systems available for it are very professional, and they're aimed not at especially technical audiences. There's a fairly low bar for people to get involved in this, and there's a very wide variety of actions that bots can take. Some positive, but there's also a lot of negative. And I think part of what we'll cover off today is that all organisations should be aware of these kinds of threats that are going on and be taking appropriate action, because their revenue, their data, and their customers' brand reputation could all be easily affected by this. I think, but on the back of that, make sure you've got an appropriate bot strategy. Make sure you're considering an appropriate level of defence, and make sure that is a way that will allow you to get full control over bot strategy. And hand over back now to Danny to see whether there's any questions that anyone would like to ask the three of us.
Hi everyone, that was a great insight from our panelists, and we have had a few questions in. I'm going to start with a question from 𝗫𝗏, who asked, what strategies do you recommend for card fraud analysts to mitigate bot issues?
Yeah, I can start on that one, Danny, and then Scott and Andy, maybe you have some thoughts as well. But I think one of the most critical elements on this is for the card fraud analyst to have that conversation with security about the cards they're issuing, about what they have out there, so that security teams, as they're implementing their bot management systems, as they're selecting them, can make sure that they are accounting for card fraud use cases. And card fraud might be, for example, with gift cards, almost similar to a credential stuffing attack, trying to enter as many gift card numbers as possible until they find one that hits, things like that. So being able to make sure that your system is searching for those types of attacks is going to be critical. But yeah, I think the first step is to make sure that your fraud team is engaged with your security team and making sure that they're accounting for that use case.
Great. Do Andy or Scott have anything to add to that?
The only thing from my point of view to add is just, again, to be aware of the complexity that may go into some of those card fraud attacks, the multiple steps that may go in. So we quite often see very large scale carding attacks. We quite often see those, they won't actually perpetrate any fraud, they will just be testing whether they're valid card numbers. And we quite often see them associated with things like fake account creation, so that there'll be a large amount of fake accounts created and they will then be used to test credit cards, or they will use valid credit cards mixed in with real credit cards or real accounts, so that you're not getting big long streams of failure. So I think it is about looking at the wider picture of how that attack will be undertaken and make sure you've got appropriate defences against that.
That's really interesting. Thank you both for your responses there. I hope that was helpful. And for our next question, from 𝗫𝗓𝗃. What was the website where you could see if loyalty points or gift cards were for sales? I think this is to Scott. And then the second part of the question, in essence, would that show if credentials on your site have been compromised?
Yeah, so there's a couple of sites that we've shown. One of them is 𝗨𝗨. So 𝗨𝗨 and 𝗨𝗶𝗳 are quite interesting because you can't go on them and search for credentials. You have to find links to people's marketplace, so to speak, pages on those sites to actually see what they've got for sale. So a bit of Google foo around searching for certain terms on those sites might help you, or on other sites. One of the other ones that we showed on the original slide, or the original slide that I started on, was it's called 131337x.2 is that particular site. Some of the stuff, for example, Genesis Market have shown is a invite only one, so you do have to be invited into those marketplaces to find out what's going on there. Sorry, what was the second part of the question? I've missed that bit.
So 𝗫𝗓𝗃 was asking, would the website where you can see loads of points and gift cards for sale show if credentials on your website have been compromised?
It would depend on the site, really. In some cases, yes, you can see that type of data, because people will sell say stuffed accounts in bulk, so you would see a bulk of them. But then in other cases, you've got somebody that's kind of selling things through a site, so it's like they're kind of proxying access to someone else's account because they're selling the vouchers or the coupons or the loyalty points through it. So there's a couple of different ways people would go about monetizing these accounts, so it would depend on the context of the business and so on.
Okay, I hope that answered the question. I realise it's a bit of a complex one there, and I think some of the slides that Scott went through did show a little bit more about what you can see in terms of the credential market. So when we circulate the on-demand webinar following today's session, I hope that will give you an opportunity to dig back through there. And if not, please feel free to follow up and we can answer any additional questions. So just a few more. So one from Ashley, what makes customers invest in bot management?
I can take that one, Danny. I think there are a couple of things that are going to make a customer invest in bot management. One, realizing that they're not able to do business the way they want to, that bots are preventing their customers from interacting with their site, that their customers are getting unhappy about credential stuffing attacks or fraud, or seeing DDoS and other types of attacks limiting the user's experience with their site. Ultimately, bot management is often about making sure that your end customer has a great experience working with you and interacting with you. And if bots are limiting that and creating problems and costing time and money to deal with them, then that's the overarching problem that you're investing in bot management to solve.
Great.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, was that?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I think echo what I was saying on that. We see two very specific, or two variants of groups. We see one who is responding to a specific problem, and there's a wide variety of those problems. It may be credential stuffing attacks, or it may be another problem that they're trying to deal with. And the other group we see is people who are thinking more strategically, and they, are putting bot management in as part of an overall security policy. And again, they're moving forward to try and stop this before they get in a particular harsh problem. We see those two groups of people, and as time goes on, we're seeing more of the strategic minded people who are seeing this as part of an overall security policy, as Sandy was mentioning.
Yes, that's two very interesting different use cases there. It's interesting to get the two perspectives. So I suppose that kind of leads us on to, in terms of strategy, nicely onto our next question. So thinking about how bot attacks are evolving, what does that mean from a protection standpoint? I think this is probably a good one for yourself, Sandy.
Yeah, I think what that means is that your detection and your defense has to constantly evolve. You know, we started years and years ago, bots were fairly simple, but bots get more and more sophisticated, and they become better at evading detection. They become better at avoiding and evading CAPTCHAs. They start to take on more low and slow types of attacks where they're sort of underneath the limit and trying to evade detection from that standpoint. So in order to constantly keep up with how bots evolve, you need to make sure that you are regularly updating your detection mechanisms and tracking according to the latest in bot attacks. So making sure that you're working with your vendors and others to have the latest threat intelligence, understand how bots are operating now, and have the tooling that responds to those updated and latest attacks, both from a detection and from a protection standpoint.
And then to both Andy and Scott from there, what does that mean in terms of what customers can actually do? What should they be asking of their vendors? Are they asking about having the right accuracy and visibility of their traffic? Because as you both mentioned, the attack vectors are changing in terms of where bot attacks are targeting businesses. So businesses are looking for more intelligence. They actually need to be asking.
Yeah, I think I think as Sandy was saying, bots are getting ever more sophisticated, and that is partly being driven by the increased amount of defence that's in place. I think it's really important to understand how your bot detection tool is going to work and understand how that will evolve, because as soon as the defence is in place, the bot will be trying to find a way around it. So we need to make sure that there is a defence or a technique in place that will spot those evolving and new attacks as quickly as possible, so that we can make sure that we're staying ahead of the bots. And I think, as you were saying, Danny, it's also really important to remember there's many different types of bots out there. Some are very bad, some may be good or bad depending on your particular business model, and make sure you have that level of intelligence over those bots and the level of control over making sure that you're only stopping the bots you want to stop, and you're letting the bots through that may be positive for your particular business model that you run.
Yeah, and that ties back in with understanding your overall bot strategy and traffic that's actually coming into your website.
Yeah, absolutely. It's important that you have a bot defense tool that understands that the needs of every website and the means of implementation of every website will vary and evolve over time, and make sure that your whole web presence is defended as well. Make sure that you're not just doing a really good job of protecting your website, and then the attackers will move on to your API or your mobile app or some other platform that is an easy point. Attackers will always attack the least defended point that they can.
Yeah, and then a final one for all of you. So Sandy, as you mentioned earlier, you would previously have talked about inventory hoarding for a use case, and now it's all about availability for groceries and toilet roll. And we've all seen a huge shift in online activity over the last few months. But how has this actually affected in terms of the increase in traffic? Have we seen a shift in bot behavior, or is it just an increase in overall traffic?
I think we're certainly seeing an increase in traffic, but as I talked about earlier, we are seeing a shift in behavior, because at the moment, tickets to a show are not particularly a desirable piece of inventory that anyone's going after. But hand sanitizer, everybody wants that. And so hoarding bots in particular are going to go after desirable inventory. And keep in mind that, as Andy said at the beginning, these are business logic attacks. So they're really striving to take advantage of, standard business logic, how sites operate, and go for the attacks that are going to make the attackers the most money. At the moment, the things that are going to make the most money are more sort of basic groceries and necessities that 6 months ago we would have looked at and said, well, that's not particularly high value. So, people rob banks because that's where the money is, right? Same type of thing here.
Yeah, just to add on to Sandy's point as well, which I thought was quite interesting. We've had customer conversations, and with the pandemic that's gone on and the what happened to the high street and everything having to sort of close down, a lot of businesses were saying, their website became their sole source of revenue. So it was like it sort of gave them an impetus and a drive really to make sure that if that was the sole source, it was a lot more protected, and a bigger bubble was kind of put around that than might have otherwise been thought about. So that was another interesting thing that happened during this time.
Yeah, just one to add from me on that. We've actually spoke with some businesses who've seen sort of the opposite effects, in that their business is quite hard hit by the coronavirus affair. So they were particularly travel businesses, which obviously there's no particular demand for. But what they've seen is that the bot demand is still very active, but has become a very big part of their traffic rather than a smaller part, which has meant that the costs associated with serving bot traffic are now fairly substantial in a time when they've got very low income. So therefore, they're actually looking to step up some of their bot defenses and spend money, even though it's a time when you think spending will be a lot less for those companies. We're actually spending to get rid of this traffic that is running up costs, and they're getting no business benefit.
That's really interesting. And it's something that I suppose we can expect to hear more about as we find out more about the trends that have occurred following the pandemic, because it's unprecedented activity, and we don't know what the behaviours of bot traffic and human traffic are going to look like in this unknown environment. Great, well, thank you all very much for those responses. As I mentioned earlier, we will be sending out the recording of the webinar along with an opportunity to send any more questions that you might have to our panelists. So please do feel free, if any questions occur to you later on, to follow up, and we will gladly respond. Thank you very much for attending today. It's been a great pleasure to have our speakers on board, and thank you very much to Sandy for joining us from Forrester, and we hope to work with you again soon.
Thanks for having me, Danny.
Great, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Danny.